It began in silence. A candle burned low in the corner of the royal chapel, its flame bending toward the draught that crept through the stone walls. Beyond the glass, dawn was only a rumor, a soft gray light brushing the edge of the horizon. The palace still slept, wrapped in velvet and cold marble. And in that fragile quiet, a young girl took her first steps into history. She was not meant to be seen, not yet. Just another court attendant, a face among dozens. But there was something in her, something too alive for such a place. The way she paused to listen when the bells rang. The way she looked at the sky as if it still meant something. Her name is lost in the dust of time. Some say she was the daughter of a minor noble, others that she was a lady-in-waiting sent to serve the queen. But everyone agreed on one thing. When the king first saw her, something inside him stirred that had long been buried. The king was a man of iron. His smile was a weapon, his word a sentence. Years of betrayal had hardened him into something less than human, a ruler made of duty and pride. But as he passed through the hall that morning, his eyes caught hers, just for a moment, and he hesitated. That pause was the beginning. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was her quietness, or the strange calm that surrounded her, like a prayer whispered in a storm. She did not bow too deeply, nor seek his gaze. She simply existed, softly, purely, like a rose blooming in the wrong season. Days turned into weeks. The court noticed how often the king lingered near her, asking meaningless questions just to hear her speak. Her words were simple, never daring, yet they carried honesty, something he had not heard in years. In her presence, the noise of politics faded. The crown felt lighter. For a man surrounded by flattery and deceit, that feeling was more dangerous than any enemy. At first, no one dared to comment. But the palace was alive. Its walls could whisper. The servants began to talk, and talk spread faster than truth ever could. Some said the king had fallen under her spell. Others said she reminded him of someone he had lost, perhaps a wife, perhaps himself. Still, the girl remained unaware of the storm building around her. She moved with quiet grace. Her kindness offered freely, never as a weapon. When she smiled, even the coldest hearts felt something thaw. But in a place where affection meant power, kindness was not a virtue. It was a threat. The queen noticed first. Her glances turned sharp, her prayers louder. She would watch the girl during mass, her lips moving silently, not in blessing, but in warning. The courtiers followed, their jealousy disguised as loyalty. Every small gesture became a story, every word a spark, and the king, lost in the fragile warmth she brought, did not see the fire spreading. He began inviting her to small gatherings, letting her sit among nobles who sneered behind jeweled fans. Her laughter, light and unguarded, filled the halls, and that only made them hate her more. They called her naive, a common girl pretending to be pure. But in truth, she was the only honest thing left in that palace. One evening during a winter feast, the king lifted a goblet and asked her to sing. She hesitated, trembling before the silent crowd. Then she began, her voice soft, trembling at first, then steady, like a prayer rising through the dark. The song spoke of mercy, of a love that forgives even the cruel. When it ended, the king's eyes glistened. He looked not like a ruler, but like a man who had suddenly remembered his own heart. The room remained silent for a moment too long. Then, quietly, the courtiers began to applaud. Slow, forced, brittle. They smiled, but their smiles were sharp as blades. That night, they began to plan her ruin. Letters were written, confessions forged. Old enemies found new allies in envy. The queen's advisors whispered that the girl had bewitched the king, that she was dangerous, a threat to the crown's dignity. And the king, blind in his fragile hope, believed none of it. Not yet. Still, something in him began to tremble. He noticed how her laughter faltered when he entered a room, how she looked over her shoulder more often. The joy that once surrounded her was fading, replaced by fear. The palace had turned on her. But the girl did not run. She stayed, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of love. Maybe she believed that truth could still survive in such a place. She continued her duties, greeting even those who hated her with gentleness. Yet every night she would kneel beside her bed and whisper prayers that only the walls could hear. "Let me be unseen," she might have said. "Let me fade quietly." But history has no mercy for those who shine too brightly in dark places. The king began to change again. The softness she had awakened in him started to war with his pride. The courtiers' lies reached his ears daily, each one dripping with poison. He tried to silence them, but doubt is a seed that grows even in a stone heart. And so the distance began, a few missed meetings, a glance avoided, a silence that lasted a moment too long. The girl noticed. She always did. She still smiled when he passed, still bowed her head. But her eyes told the truth. They were no longer filled with light, only with the quiet knowledge that her time was ending. One evening, as the candles burned low, she was seen standing in the garden. The roses had withered in the frost, their petals fallen and brown. She knelt, touching one gently, as if mourning herself. A guard watching from the shadows later said she whispered something. A name, or maybe a prayer. Then she stood, turned, and walked back toward the palace lights. That was the last time anyone saw her unguarded. By morning, the whispers had turned to shouts. The queen demanded justice. The nobles spoke of sin and scandal. And the king, the same man who had once found his soul in her kindness, now stood silent. He did not defend her. Perhaps he believed he was protecting her by saying nothing. Perhaps he feared that speaking her name aloud would confirm what they accused him of feeling. But silence in the world of kings is the cruelest confession. In the days that followed, her fate was sealed by ink and envy. The girl who had once been a rose in the shadows was now called a serpent, a witch, a danger to the realm. And yet, those who saw her led away swore that she walked with her head high. No crown, no jewels, only grace. She never understood the depth of the change she had made. But the king did. For when she was gone, the palace seemed to darken. The warmth she carried, that fragile spark of humanity, had left with her. And in the echo of her absence, the king felt something he had not felt in years. Loss. And somewhere deep within him, a question that would never find an answer. Why is it that the purest souls must pay for the sins of others? It began with a whisper. A faint sound, like the rustle of silk behind closed doors. The kind of whisper that slips through walls, changes shape in the dark, and grows louder each time it's repeated. The palace was alive with it. Her name, once spoken gently, with admiration, was now carried on every tongue like a secret no one wanted to keep. What had started as fascination had turned to suspicion. What was once innocent was now dangerous. The girl did not change. The world around her did. She still moved through the marble halls with quiet steps, offering small smiles to those who met her gaze. But eyes that once looked at her with warmth now turned away. Conversations stopped when she entered. Servants who once bowed their heads now curtsied too quickly, eager to escape her presence. Something had shifted in the air. It was the queen who noticed first. The growing distance between herself and the king. He no longer lingered at her side during Mass. He no longer asked for her counsel in matters of state. Instead, his gaze wandered toward another corner of the room, toward her. At first the queen said nothing. She had seen it before. Men drawn to beauty, to youth, to gentleness that came without demand. But there was something about this girl that unsettled her. It was not arrogance or deceit. It was her silence, her stillness. And so the whispers began. They started among the ladies of the court, jealous women wrapped in jewels and hunger for power. "She has bewitched him," one said. "There's witchcraft in her eyes." Another claimed she had seen the girl walking alone in the gardens at night, murmuring prayers that sounded more like spells. By morning, those whispers had reached the council chamber. The king dismissed them at first. He laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. But something inside him began to tremble. Because in his heart, he knew what they feared was not witchcraft, but truth. She had bewitched him. not with potions or dark charms, but with something far more dangerous: kindness. Her presence had stripped him of his armor. In her company, he was no longer the king. He was simply a man, flawed, lonely, tired, and that frightened him more than any curse. The court saw it too. They saw the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, the way he forgot the weight of the crown in her presence. And in a kingdom built on fear, tenderness was the greatest weakness of all. Rumors became stories. Stories became accusations. Some said the girl had poisoned the king's mind, that she used secret herbs to keep him under her spell. Others whispered that she was sent by the enemies of the crown, that her innocence was a mask for treachery. And the girl, trapped in a web she could not see, felt the walls close in. There were nights she would sit alone by the window, watching the torches flicker outside the palace gates. The air smelled of rain and iron. She could hear the faint echo of laughter in the great hall below, laughter that once welcomed her, now sharp as knives. She did not cry. She prayed, but even her prayers began to feel dangerous. When she entered the chapel, she felt the eyes of the priests upon her. When she reached for holy water, their hands twitched, as if the touch of her fingers might stain it. The palace that once seemed golden now felt like a tomb. Even the king's affection began to change. Where there was once comfort, there was now tension, an invisible distance neither could name. He would call for her, then fall silent when she arrived. He would look at her as if searching for proof that she was real, that she was not what they said. But every accusation left a mark. Every whisper became a seed of doubt. One evening, he found her in the gardens, standing beside the frozen fountain. The moonlight touched her face, pale and fragile as glass. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and for a moment the world seemed still. He wanted to tell her he believed her, that none of it mattered, but the words never came. Power had made him a coward, and so he simply turned away. The next morning the rumors grew darker. They said the girl had angered the queen, that she had mocked her in secret, that she had used charms to make the king ill so she might be his only comfort. Lies, all of them, but lies told by the right people have a way of becoming truth. Soon even her friends began to disappear. The ladies who once shared her laughter now crossed the room to avoid her. The servants who once brought her flowers now left them wilting at her door. She began to dream of escape, of quiet fields, of her mother's voice, of the sound of rain without fear. But she knew she could not leave. The court was a cage, and she was its most beautiful prisoner. Days turned to weeks, each one colder than the last, and through it all, the whispers grew louder. Some nights, she could almost hear them through the walls of her chamber, soft voices murmuring her name, like ghosts in the stone. The walls seemed alive, breathing with the same malice that filled the court. Once, she woke to find a single black feather on her pillow. She didn't know how it got there, but in that moment, she felt it. A truth she could no longer ignore. They wanted her gone, not just forgotten, erased. The king still cared for her, that much she knew, but his love was turning into something fragile, something desperate. He could not protect her without betraying himself, and she could not live without his protection. Theirs was not a romance. It was a tragedy written in slow motion. One afternoon, as snow fell over the palace, the queen walked through the great hall. Her eyes were calm, her smile gentle, but the court watched her in silence, sensing something final in her steps. That evening the king did not speak during supper. The girl sat far away, her hands trembling against the goblet of wine she could not drink. The courtiers watched, waiting for a single word, a single mistake. None came. Only the sound of the wind against the glass. When she left the hall that night, the doors closed behind her like the ceiling of a tomb. She did not know it yet, but the whispers had already done their work. The queen's sorrow had turned to vengeance. The council's fear had turned to accusation. And the king's silence, his one true defense, had become the weapon that would destroy her. The palace, once filled with her laughter, now spoke only in shadows. The girl had become a symbol, not of love, but of weakness, and the walls that once protected her now whispered her doom. It was the last night. Outside, the wind moved softly through the prison yard, whispering against the stones. The air was cold, the kind of cold that seemed to hold its breath, as if even the night was afraid of what would come with morning. In the small cell she sat alone, no crown, no silk gown, only a thin gray cloak and a candle that burned too quickly. Its light flickered across the wall, shaping shadows that swayed like ghosts. She had stopped crying hours ago. There were no tears left to give. For weeks she had begged to understand. For mercy, for truth, for reason. None had come. The same walls that had echoed with laughter now held only silence. And yet, there was peace in her stillness. The world outside her cell was full of noise. The city waited for dawn, for the sound of drums, for the spectacle that the court called justice. But here, in this quiet, she had found something they never would: forgiveness. The girl who once walked through the palace gardens with flowers in her hands now traced her fingers over the rough stone floor. Each crack felt like a memory. Each breath was a prayer. She thought of her family, her mother's face, the smell of home. She thought of the king, not as a ruler, not as the man who condemned her, but as the broken soul she had once pitied. She still pitied him. That was her greatest sin. Across the river, the palace windows burned with light. The king was awake. He had not slept in days. Servants waited outside his chamber, listening to the sound of pacing footsteps. Back and forth, like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. On the table before him lay a single parchment, her death warrant. His signature, dark and final, at the bottom. The ink had dried days ago, but the weight of it hadn't. He had tried to believe the stories, the rumors of witchcraft, the whispers of betrayal, but the truth haunted him. He knew she was innocent. He had always known. Power demanded her death, and power was the only god he had left. He poured himself another glass of wine, though his hands trembled too much to drink. The candle beside him flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw her, standing in the corner, her eyes calm, her face unafraid. He blinked, and she was gone. The silence pressed against him. He could almost hear the tolling of the morning bell, though it was hours away. He wondered what she was thinking, whether she hated him, whether she still prayed for him. He hoped she didn't, because forgiveness, he thought, was the one thing he no longer deserved. In her cell, the night deepened. A guard came to bring bread and water, but she did not eat. She thanked him softly, her voice steady. He hesitated before leaving. She was unlike any prisoner he had ever seen. Not angry, not afraid, just still. She asked for paper. They gave her a scrap and a piece of charcoal. By candlelight, she began to write, slowly, carefully, her hands shaking from the cold. It was not a plea, not a curse, but a farewell. "May God forgive those who have wronged me," she wrote, "and may he show mercy to the king who has lost himself." Her words were gentle, almost childlike. She paused after each line, as if listening to the silence for approval. When she finished, she folded the paper neatly and placed it beside the candle. The flame trembled, its light catching the curve of her face. For the first time in days, she smiled. Perhaps it was not courage, but surrender. A quiet understanding that death could not destroy what was pure. She knelt then on the cold stone floor, her head bowed. Her lips moved without sound. No one knows what she prayed for that night. Some say it was for her own soul. Others say it was for his. Back in the palace, the king stood by the window, watching the horizon pale toward dawn. He could see the tower from here, small and distant, a shape of shadow against the silver sky. Somewhere within those walls, she waited for the sun to rise. He wanted to go to her, to call off the execution, to take back the words that had damned her. But the council would never allow it. The kingdom would see it as weakness. And so he stayed, trapped by the same walls he had built around himself. When the first bell rang, his heart stuttered. The sound carried through the mist, low and solemn, a sound that seemed to echo across his very bones. He sank into his chair, hands clasped over his face. No tears came, only silence, The courtyard filled with people long before dawn. Merchants, nobles, beggars, all waiting. The gallows had been dressed with fresh boards. A priest stood nearby, his eyes downcast. When she appeared, the crowd fell still. She wore a simple white gown. Her hair, unbound, glowed faintly in the cold morning light. Her hands were clasped around a small wooden cross. She looked not like a prisoner, but like a spirit walking through the living. As she reached the scaffold, she turned once, not toward the crowd, but toward the palace far beyond. For a moment her gaze lingered there. Perhaps she thought of him. Perhaps she prayed he was watching. The priest whispered his blessing. She thanked him softly. When they asked for her final words, she spoke clearly. "I forgive them," she said, "and I pray that my death will bring peace to those who have none." A murmur ran through the crowd, not of hatred, but of shame. Even the guards looked away. The executioner trembled as he placed the blindfold. She refused it. "I will face it," she said quietly. "I will face the light." And when the blade fell, it was said that the sun broke through the clouds for the first time that morning. The king felt it. He was standing in the chapel when the moment came. A sudden stillness in the air, a tremor he could not name. The candle beside him flickered and went out. He knew. He did not speak, did not call for his counsel. He simply sank to his knees on the cold marble floor and pressed his forehead to the stone. The silence in the chapel was heavy, almost holy. For the first time in years, he prayed, not for her, not for forgiveness, but for punishment. He had taken her from the world, and in doing so, had taken the last good thing left within himself. Outside, the bells rang again. The city returned to its noise, its laughter, its ordinary sins. But in the palace, nothing was ordinary anymore. The king no longer walked through the gardens. He no longer spoke of mercy or love. Those words had died with her. In the years that followed, he built new towers, new walls, as if stone could keep ghosts away. But no matter how high he built, her voice still found him. Sometimes in dreams, sometimes in silence, always the same words. "I forgive you." And each time he woke with tears he could no longer explain. The night before, her end had been his end too. She faced death with grace. He faced life with guilt. And history, forever silent, kept both their secrets, buried beneath the whisper of the wind and the tolling of the morning bell. A cold wind moves through the empty corridors of the palace. The sound of footsteps, distant, echoing. Somewhere a candle flickers and dies. Once these halls rang with laughter, the rustle of silk gowns, the music of a woman's voice that could calm a storming heart. Now only silence, and the silence speaks his name. The king sits alone in his chamber. The fire before him burns low, painting his face in golden shadow. A crown rests beside his hand, heavy, gleaming, cold. He doesn't touch it. Once that crown had meant everything: power, order, legacy. But tonight it feels like a shackle, because he knows, no matter how high his throne, no matter how loud the songs of praise, he will never escape her. The ghost he made. It began quietly, as all hauntings do. A scent in the air, roses, faint and impossible. The whisper of fabric behind him when no one stood there. The soft echo of laughter carried on the wind. At first, he told himself it was memory, guilt playing tricks on a weary mind. But guilt, like love, is never content to whisper. It grows, it invades. He begins to see her everywhere. In the mirror, her reflection behind his shoulder. In the gardens, where she once walked with sunlight in her hair. At the banquet table, an empty seat he can't bear to fill. Everywhere he turns, she lingers, not in body, but in presence. She had entered his life like light breaking through a storm. Young, bright, fearless. And in her, he had glimpsed something he'd almost forgotten he possessed. Humanity. She spoke to him not as a king, but as a man. She looked into his eyes and saw not the crown, but the heart beneath it. And perhaps that's why her loss cuts deeper than any wound. Because in killing her, he killed the last part of himself that was still capable of love. Now he wears his power like armor, and like chains. He walks through his court, surrounded by courtiers who smile too wide and bow too deep. They praise him. They flatter him. But he can hear the truth behind their words. Fear. The same fear that condemned her. They had whispered she bewitched him, that her beauty was poison, that her voice bent his will. And he, desperate to prove himself unshaken, unruled by emotion, let their poison drip into his ear. He chose pride over mercy, crown over conscience, and in the cold dawn light, he watched her die. The king dreams often now, dreams of her walking toward him in white, her eyes gentle, her lips curved in forgiveness. But when he reaches for her, she turns to smoke. He wakes drenched in sweat, the taste of her name on his tongue. Each morning he dresses for court, the ritual unchanged, the velvet, the jewels, the gold, yet none of it fits as it once did. His robes hang heavier. The crown presses harder. He speaks to no one of his torment. He cannot. To admit regret would be to admit weakness, and kings do not weep. But sometimes, when the chamber doors are shut and the world falls quiet, he presses his hands to his face and whispers her name into the darkness. He wonders if she hears. The courtiers notice the change. They speak in hushed tones, how the king has grown colder, slower, haunted. Some say he sees her ghost at night, walking the palace corridors with calm steps and downcast eyes. Others claim the chapel bells ring on their own, as if she still kneels there in prayer. No one dares to ask him directly, but they all feel it, the shift in the air, the sorrow that lingers, unseen yet undeniable, as though her innocence has become the court's silent judge, forever watching. One evening, years later, the king returns to the place he once condemned her, the tower. He ascends the narrow stairs alone. Each step creaks like a confession. The room is empty now, cold stone and dust, but he can feel her presence, the echo of her last prayer, the calmness in her voice as she forgave him before the blade fell. He stands in the spot where she had once knelt. The world feels smaller here, the air heavier. He removes his crown and sets it on the floor. For the first time in years, he speaks aloud, not as a king, but as a man stripped bare. "I see you everywhere," he murmurs, and yet nowhere at all. No answer comes, only silence. But within that silence, he understands something terrible and true. He had built an empire of fear. He had ruled with iron and pride. And still, the thing that endures beyond all of it is her. Not her name in history, not her title or bloodline, but her grace, her forgiveness. It burns brighter than his legacy, and it haunts him more than her death. Years pass. The throne grows colder. New queens come and go, new wars rise and fall, but her presence never fades. Sometimes at night when the torches burn low, the guards swear they see her figure near the window, calm, almost smiling, looking toward the stars. Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps some loves and some sins are too deep to die. The king grows old, his hands trembling where they once commanded armies. He still wears the crown, but it no longer feels like victory. It feels like penance. He spends his final years in a strange kind of quiet, neither peace nor torment, but something in between. Each time he closes his eyes, he sees her face, not angry, not vengeful, only still. And in that stillness, he finds both punishment and mercy. Because the truth is, ghosts don't always come to haunt. Sometimes they come to remind us of what we destroyed, and of what we could have been. The candle flickers once more, the flame bowing low before the night. The king's breath slows, the fire fades, and as the last ember dies, the halls fall silent again. Empty, but not alone. Somewhere within those walls, her presence remains, soft as a sigh, eternal as regret. The rose he once crushed beneath the crown still blooms unseen in the darkness.